Hello, welcome to the final fall presentation of the Justice Sessions. I am Keith Cartwright, Chair of the Department of English, and welcome you all to a series that's been a great source for bringing students, faculty, community leaders, and activists together at a time when we really need to reason, listen, and dream together more than ever. A few words before we move on to our great presentation today. We plan to have a spring schedule together to share with you soon. This is the end of the fall series, but spring starts anew. The music that we've been using to introduce this series, I'd like to say a word about before we move forward. It's an old cylinder recording from Cuba. Forget the year, 1902 or 1904. But it's music by James Weldon Johnson and John Rosamond Johnson, a big hit back then called Under the Bamboo Tree. So we're trying to celebrate Jacksonville all we can. And that was an old cylinder by a couple of composers right from here. Well, today we have a special treat for ending a great discussion led by Dr. Natasha Christie and Sherri Jackson on felon disenfranchisement and its impact. It's particularly difficult and disproportionate impact on communities of color. Dr. Christie is chair of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at UNF. She's written on a number of topics, including the politics of felon disenfranchisement in the 50 states, cross-sector collaboration in Florida's drug courts, accountability in the public sector, and the rhetoric of the Obama presidency. She's currently working to create an index addressing states' levels of social welfare inclusivity in relation to immigrants and ex-felons. Sherri Jackson has called Jacksonville her home for over 20 years. She's a program manager for a local nonprofit organization that assists adults with increasing their literacy skills. She enjoys helping those in her community and considers herself a servant leader. Her undergraduate degree in sociology was earned in 2015, and she is now completing her master's in public administration here at UNF. And so I turn it over to Dr. Christie and Ms. Jackson. Thank you. Oh, one last thing. Those of you in the audience, when you are, if you would like to ask questions, please send your questions to the Q&A box right beneath your screen, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Keith. I really appreciate being here today to talk about this topic. This topic has been very close to my heart for a number of years, and those of you who know me know that I talk constantly about this topic, and I think that's essentially how Sherri and I initially met and began talking about this. And I think it's really important as researchers, when we talk about topics that reflect experiences of individuals, their lived experiences, it's important to create a space for them to share their perspectives. And I really do want to extend a gracious thanks to Sherri for joining me in this space today to do so. So I appreciate you doing that.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks. And I appreciate all of you tuning in to listen to this talk today, especially since many of us were up very late at night trying to keep up with the election results. So the fact that you're here today to listen to this topic is great, and I appreciate having you, and I hope you enjoy our presentation. So sort of to start thinking about felon disenfranchisement, just in context, we have about over 5 million Americans are currently disenfranchised due to a felony conviction. So with felon disenfranchisement, it essentially bars anyone with a felony from voting. It has become problematic for quite some time because this practice has been used in a way that it disproportionately impacts certain communities. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. And we're also going to talk about something that isn't really addressed often enough, which is the individual impact. And Sherri will have a lot to offer in that respect. We're going to begin with just a really short video. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you all, a short video that's produced by the Sentencing Project titled Free the Vote. And in this short video, they highlight the individuals who are affected by felon disenfranchisement. And then from there, we'll go into our discussion. Okay, it worked a second ago. Give me just a second. Here we are. Okay, so let's start. We will start the video from the Sentencing Project, and then hopefully through our discussion, we will talk about the history of felon disenfranchisement, the state of felon disenfranchisement in Florida, the effects of Amendment 4, and its effects on communities of color.
I think in my lifetime, this is the most important election I know of. It really, really upsets me that I'm probably not going to get to vote in. That just really hurts to the core.
I'm much more than my crime. I did that and I paid my dues. Why can I not vote?
This call is from a federal prison.
A lot of black people have been beaten and been killed for this right to vote. As being African American myself also, I hold that right sacred, and I would love to be able to exercise it.
When I got out of prison, I was unable to do many things. And then I learned not only could I not vote when I got out of prison, but then I couldn't vote the whole 10 years of my probation either.
I myself could not vote until just this year. It took me almost a decade.
I'm formerly incarcerated. I was able to regain my rights to vote in Missouri. When I moved to Kentucky, I again lost those rights. For reasons that really don't make sense, I can't vote again.
I have friends who said, why is it affecting you so much that you can't vote? And that would always shock me. I'd be like, because that's one of my basic rights as an American citizen, is to vote and to be heard and to have my voice count. Not being able to do that for 24 years really weighed heavily on me.
All these things happening with our community and not being able to have a say, it's not a good feeling at all. I really felt like really less than a man.
We've ran into so many people that, have given up, just like how I had given up.
So I cast my vote for the first time in 24 years during this year's primaries. I went to the voting machine, I cast my votes. I mean, the tears were just coming down my face. My husband had tears in his eyes too. And the people were just so happy, they were cheering. I mean, they made this big deal of it. And I can't tell you how wonderful it was to get people who got why I was so excited about it.
To be here in 2020 and be able to cast my vote on a year like this, it was pretty amazing. As I was walking in the building, I actually danced like the Wiz, ease on down the road, all the way in the door.
I'm a feeling election night. You know, it's just a great feeling that still being like a citizen of our community in our city of Washington, D.C., and to know that I have a say, man, that's just going to be such an amazing feeling. Something, like I said, that I never expected to see or experience while being incarcerated. I have two beautiful young granddaughters that are growing up in this world, and I want only the best for them.
I feel like finally my voice is being heard again. Finally, I matter. Finally, I'm a member of society 100% again.
Our vote does matter. Our vote is important, and it's a part of our collective power.
My final wish for 2020 would be that everyone who can vote does vote. I hope people vote for those of us that can't.
Pretty powerful messages to hear from these individuals who whose rights have been stripped away due to having a felony conviction. The history of felon disenfranchisement goes back pretty much to our nation's founding. And what's interesting about it is that it didn't start the way that it's ended up, as with most of our laws that has happened in our country. It started as what they would call civil death. So if someone committed a crime that was against the community, they were basically subjected to civil death. And civil death was sort of like an excommunication. They would lose their ability to vote, for one. They would lose their ability to participate in government in any form. They would often lose forfeit their assets as well. So these individuals weren't necessarily considered part of the community anymore. And what happened is that over time, particularly after the Civil War, and of course, unfortunately, starting out with our southern states, these states decided to expand their criminal codes to include crimes that they believed African Americans would be more likely to be convicted of. And by expanding those criminal codes, essentially, they enacted the felon disenfranchisement disproportionately on that population. And some have argued that this was done intentionally to basically to sort of water down the vote, especially given the 15th Amendment, its passage, to water down the votes of the African American community. So there is some racial impact within this practice's origins that have continued over time. We can't necessarily ignore the fact that race did play a part in the origin of this law. And we also cannot expect that over time that has gone away either. It is still present, it is still active. And Florida in particular, it has been sort of one of the worst states in terms of felon disenfranchisement and its impact on African American communities. And I would like to talk about sort of some background on how it is that Florida—
I think in my lifetime, this is the—
Let's see. Let me get to the next slide. Bear with me.
I think
There we are. Sorry about that. It's gone again. Okay, there we are. So with Florida, just looking at this chart, you can see that Florida's incarceration rate compared to the United States and other countries is just off the chart. And with such a high incarceration rate, you should in turn expect a high felon disenfranchisement rate. So, you know, you're seeing this play out in Florida because of this. If we look at that breakdown by race, you can see that Black individuals are disproportionately impacted through incarceration. Their incarceration rates are way higher than that of the white population or the Hispanic population. And this is measured as the number of people incarcerated per 100,000 of that group in the population. So for African Americans, that's a very large amount, essentially being sort of what they call disappeared, taken away from that community. And if you think of this in terms of just sort of beyond the individual aspect, it affects communities as well. So think about that large number of individuals being taken away from these communities. And as he said in the video, he's taken away from these communities. More than likely, he's going to return to this community and he has no say in terms of what happens in his community. Sherri, stop me at any point if you want to add anything, because I can keep going on.
Sure. Yeah, just to kind of piggyback off of what you just said, the person having no say as they return into the community. I've always joked around and said that's kind of like taxation without representation. It's like you're expected to be a law-abiding citizen, you know, get a job, do the right thing, pay your taxes and all, but you're not going to participate in the civil duties that everyone else is participating in. And as a matter of fact, not only you're not participating in it, you're not allowed to, even if you wanted to, you're not allowed to have a say in that. So that's a very good point, that you're expected to return to society whole again and full, yet not accepted as that whole full person again.
And I've got a few more data points to introduce here. And this is just another chart essentially showing the African-American felony disenfranchisement rate. This was just updated probably about 3 weeks ago by the Sentencing Project. They've put out a new publication, it's a great publication, it's called Locked Out. They update this every so often, and they do a thorough analysis of felon disenfranchisement in the United States. And looking at this map, Florida, I think it's currently at, in terms of the Black voting age population, it's estimated about 15% are disenfranchised from that population group. And that's an enormous number, especially when you think about, just think about the events of yesterday and thinking about the large number of individuals who essentially cannot participate civically in this way. Let's see, we're looking here at, this is just another overview, just to take a look at Florida and sort of what's happening in Florida, who's going to prison in Florida, where are they coming from, as you can look at sort of where we are on this chart. Duval County has had quite an increase in the number of individuals admitted to prison. And something else that a lot of people tend to forget about individuals with felony convictions, they don't always go to prison. So by looking at just this prison number, it just sort of gives us an idea of the individuals, but not necessarily, you know, the exact number. But it's good to see anyway how this change in prison population is going to impact these communities that are highlighted here in this bright blue when it comes to returning citizens and their ability to vote and impact their communities. This is some data from 2016, again, from the Sentencing Project, looking at the different rates of felon disenfranchisement. And something else that we should also pay attention to, there is also a gendered aspect to felon disenfranchisement, in the sense that Black males are overrepresented in this area. And thinking about the community aspect, if you have a large number of Black males not in the community, not participating, some studies have shown that just the removal of those individuals actually suppresses voter turnout in their home communities, in their homes. Individuals who live in their homes are not as likely to want to go out and vote. And not as likely to want to be engaged. I included this information here. In preparing for this presentation, I was watching the Senate confirmation hearings of the newest Supreme Court justice. And Senator Cruz made a comment. They were talking about felon disenfranchisement. And he made a comment that, do we want murderers to be able to get their right to vote back and to be participating, fully in society? And it made me think about the way that people think about felons. And this chart basically shows that the majority of individuals who are charged with felonies are those that are charged with non-violent felonies. The violent felonies tend to be a lower number looking at this chart. And that's just one of the myths and one of the arguments that are often brought up against giving felons their right back to vote. Currently, as you saw in the video, DC now allows prisoners to vote individuals to vote while they're incarcerated. And prior to that, it was just Maine and Vermont. And over the years, there has been an expansion in terms of moving into that direction of loosening some of these restrictions. And we saw that particularly here in Florida with Amendment 4 in 2018 with the passage of Amendment 4. So essentially with Amendment 4, the way that it was supposed to work, I'm going to go to the next slide for that. The way that Amendment 4 was essentially supposed to work was that individuals with felonies, it excluded two categories of felonies, those that were charged with murders and those that were charged with sex offenses. They were excluded specifically from the language in this amendment. So once an individual had completed all terms of their sentence, they could have their right to vote restored. However, as we know, that didn't necessarily happen. So upon its initial passage, there was a lot of excitement in the community that individuals with felony convictions could now go ahead and vote. So you did have some individuals go out and register to vote, only to find out a few months later that legislation was passed, then barring them from voting unless they paid their fines and fees. It was argued that all terms of the sentence includes fines and fees. And this is going back to what Sherri was talking about in terms of it sort of equating to a poll tax. So now those individuals who under Amendment 4 would have been allowed to vote now cannot vote because they owe quite a bit of fines and fees. And in preparing for this, I was looking at some data, and it said nearly 80% of Florida's felons are estimated to owe money to the courts. And Sherri has a very interesting story about fines and fees and the fact that it's not as easy as you think to track. For one, in our 67 counties, the clerk's office for the most part tracks this data. The clerk's office has been having the hardest time just telling people how much money they owe and where to pay that. So Sherri, I'll leave you to tell that part.
Yes, from my own personal experience, I was told when I initially applied for my right to vote back that I could not receive that until I paid the $10 that I still owed to my probation officer. Now, mind you, I was a convicted felon in the 90s, and this was told to me in 2009. So I was like, wow, well, I don't have a probation officer, and so maybe I can try to hound down, where can I pay this $10 to? Luckily, it was only $10 and not some of the astronomical fees that other people are experiencing right now. Long story short, I was very unsuccessful in getting help from anyone to tell me where it is that I paid this $10. I was first told to go to the courthouse, which I did. The courthouse didn't have any record of anything as far as me paying $10. I was told to go to the Salvation Army probation office, which I did. I ended up speaking with the supervisor there who was going to look into it. And he called me back and said, I'm sorry, I have no idea where you're going to pay this $10 to. So I wasn't getting any answers at all. So I wrote back to Tallahassee and told them, look, I would love to pay this $10. I could send it in even. Can you help me out? It actually took a year for me to get a response, and the exact response I got was the same thing I got the first time, just saying you owe $10 on this printout. No organization to pay the $10 to or anything. So it's very frustrating, and I think it's I would hope not, but I think it's kind of set up in that manner to kind of keep you disinterested in pushing forward to receive your civil rights back. I thought with the passing of Amendment 4 that may kind of alleviate those types of issues, and instead it kind of just accelerated them and made it even harder for people like myself to regain their right, just the right to vote, not referring to like restoration of being able to have firearms and things like that, but just simply just for the right to vote. The system is set up in a way to make it extremely hard to get that right back. It's not as easy as they put forward.
And the other thing that we have to consider when thinking about these fines and fees, Sherri mentioned, her fee was $10. Depending on what the individual has been charged with, those fines can increase substantially. And then there are also court user fees. You've got to pay to use the court. If you have a public defender, you've got to pay a minimal amount of money to do that. You've also got to pay a prosecution fee. So there are other user fees sort of added into that. And if you think about the way that our society is currently set up in terms of its level of welcoming to returning citizens, you have to think also about the economy and the job market. And the fact that these individuals do have such a hard time finding employment, and after finding employment, then taking care of your basic necessities and then paying those fines and fees, because those fines and fees are also linked to you getting a driver's license, for example. And that driver's license can be linked to lots of other things that are necessary for you to do in your everyday life. And in some of these cases, the fines are so astronomical that given the wages that these individuals receive, it would be a very long time before they could eventually pay off those fines and fees and get those rights restored. And in terms of employment, I think, Sherri, you've have some experience in this area as well. And we've talked a bit about employment, and just as a returning citizen, gaining access to employment.
Absolutely, yeah, that's, it seems as if it's always a financial struggle when it comes to returning citizens in one way or another. It's like, even if you're trying to do, and my goal was I need to put as much good in front of me, so that way maybe I won't, and I can it resonates with me very well what the lady said in the video. I'm much more than my crime, and how do I present that to people to be given that opportunity for that second chance, right? As I shared with Dr. Christie before, I was already employed, thankfully, but I was looking for seasonal work at, I guess I'll go ahead and tell you, it was at Target. And unfortunately, they said, I went in for the second interview, and they said, due to your recent, that's the really key that got me, your recent crime, we're unable to hire you. And this was just a few years ago. And I'm thinking, recent? Are you serious? So it was really disheartening to have that happen so long after, when you put your best foot forward, and it's like some way or another you're going to get kind of knocked down a notch again, no matter how much you try to, build yourself up and make yourself more presentable, I guess, to society, so society can accept you. And sometimes it's like never ending what I call the invisible life sentence. It's like my crime, I finished my crime. I mean, I committed the crime, I finished the time or whatever sentence it was that was given to me. But at what point do the negative consequences end? At what point is it over? I didn't receive a life sentence. So why are these repercussions constantly coming at me even years later? Why am I still feeling the effects of this? And when it comes down to merely, oh yeah, you can vote if you have the money, and in my case, thankfully, it was a small amount, but here it is again. So we're, okay, yeah, sure, you can if you have the money, or sure, we can maybe get you a lighter sentence or even get you off of this crime if you have the money to pay a lawyer and not a public defender. So unfortunately, it seems to circle right back to this, your financial state. And then how are you able to even produce, as Dr. Christie said, get those finances to pay these fines and fees that are usually very high if you're unable to get a job that's going to help not only provide for your needs, but give you this extra that you can pay those court fines or whatever it is that you might owe. So it's really like sometimes a catch-22. It's like no matter, you put 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, unfortunately. And it's just really sad. It really is.
And there's also another sort of invisible factor in this as well. It's the fact that just contact with the criminal justice system, again, can be very, very traumatic for individuals or government institutions in general, that they would rather just disengage than to have to go to the clerk's office and track down where they owe these fees. And that's an important aspect that we have to consider as well. Individuals may not want to walk back in that building where they were convicted, those years ago. And at that point, they may decide, you know what, maybe voting isn't that important. Maybe it's not worth the risk. And then we also have the situation that happened with Amendment 4, where you had individuals who registered to vote as soon as it was passed. And then when the legislature decided to add on the fines and fees, many of them were not notified, especially the ones that owed fines and fees, that they could no longer participate. And then what happens if they're not sure and they go ahead and vote? They could be then facing another felony. And that creates quite a bit of confusion. And I think it might even create some apathy in the sense that they just don't want to risk it. And they don't want to go through that again. I was looking at a report that came out of the, I think it was the Tampa Bay Times and ProPublica put together a report, and they were looking at Hillsborough County. And at the time, they were looking at 325 individuals whose voting rights were restored because their fees were paid. And of those 325, only 56 registered to vote. And that number just reminded me that there's more to this than the structural impediments of being able to vote. There's the even if you remove that financial impediment, that fear of engaging at that level may still be there and prevent individuals from participating. For example, I was looking also at the clerk's offices. There was an example from that same report where one clerk's office reported that it took them 4 to 5 hours just to calculate what one person owed. So these offices do not have the manpower that is necessary to go through and calculate all of the different fines and fees, therefore further hindering the progress that was made with the passage of this amendment. Sherri, do you have anything there?
I don't have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, and I pretty much would love to be able to just open it up at this point to a conversation and dialogue about this important topic, and especially in light of yesterday's events, and just talk a little bit more about individuals' questions, experiences. So I'd be happy to just go ahead and just create a dialogue at this point.
I will say one quick comment, Dr. Christie, in regards to what you were saying. Over the years, I have had that, I've been like that roller coaster, like 1 minute, I'm like, you know what, forget it. It's not even worth it. I don't feel like going through all this trouble. And enough is enough. Then I get to the point, I'm like, wait a minute, what are you thinking? This is important. That's why they're trying to keep it away from you. That's why they don't want you to do it. That's why they're putting all these barriers in front of you, you know? So then I'm like driving all again. And then, you know, things come up, like you said, with Amendment 4. And then they're saying, oh, well, yeah, that passed, but, you know, this is going on. So it's really tough for people like myself to kind of keep on that. Yes, I want to be a part of, you know, I want my voice to be heard. I want to be a part of society. But then it's like when you keep getting these doors slammed in your face, it makes you kind of, you know, it's like crippling. It's uneasy. Makes you feel like you're starting all over again. What's the use? You know, I'm not going to even worry about it. And hopefully we can get to a point where we don't have those feelings, because it really is so important. Like I said, I know that if it weren't over these years, like you talked about the history, those things would not have been put in place if it weren't important, if it weren't so, you know, such a heavy thing that we really need to do. So I try to keep that in mind, as well as encourage other people that I know that are in the same position to not allow those barriers to stop you from moving forward. It's important, and that's why you have those barriers in front of us. So.
And that's a really good point, because if you think about it, before the passage of Amendment 4, approximately 1.4 million Floridians, you know, could not participate. That's a voting block, essentially.
Right, and the system that they had in place before they passed Amendment 4, the waiting list. I mean, people were waiting 7 to 10 years for their case to even be seen.
Right.
In Tallahassee, which is, you know, ridiculous. And through all that time, you're just kind of sitting around twiddling your thumbs. Case is accepted, and you get your civil rights restored. But then they might say anything could come up. I've seen stories where people finally get their hearing and they say, oh, sorry, you actually voted when you shouldn't have. So now you're not able to vote at all. You should have voted in this particular election and you did. You didn't have the right to do that. And now, so because of that, we're canceling it out altogether, and you can try again at another time. Like, you know, it's really just like, oh, really? Are you serious? You know, so I think it's really important for people like myself to keep pushing forward and not allow those barriers to disinterest us in being a part of society and casting our vote in elections and things like that.
And you bring up a really good point about talking about the system that was in place prior to Amendment 4. And that system essentially was you would have to apply for executive clemency through the governor's office. And even through doing that, you still had to pay your fines and fees and be able to pay your fines and fees. There was a study that showed that during Scott's tenure, they were only able to restore around 3,000 individuals' rights to vote during that time. So you're absolutely right in the fact that there is that underlying financial element in any aspect of the restoration process.
Right.
All right, so sounds like you are ready for some questions and exchange.
Yes.
Thank you so much. One thing we can see is, though this block isn't homogeneous by any means, there's enough, it's so solid that it could provide the margin of victory in a tightly contested state like Florida time and time again. So we can see why the powers that be would want to silence or increase the voices depending on who's in power for any given election cycle. So there's obviously tremendous stakes here. So let's see. Jeremy Baker has a question, and I'll read it. So prior to the election, we saw figures like Michael Jordan, LeBron James, and Mike Bloomberg donating huge sums of money to pay off ex-felons' fees and fines. I donated to the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. What came of these efforts, since so few ex-felons seem to have gotten their vote back? It infuriates me that the Florida legislature has blocked the progress we, the voters, tried to extend to our neighbors. That is the question.
Thank you for that question. And essentially, of from my understanding, from what they have, the monies they have received to pay off individuals' fines and fees, they have gone to individuals' fines and fees. But the problem is not so much, it's kind of the problem that we still have with the general population, getting individuals out to vote. So the fines and fees may have been paid and these individuals may have registered, but they may not have actually turned out to vote. And those numbers we are not going to have for quite some time either. Even looking at the registration numbers since the passage of Amendment 4, I was looking at different organizations and their estimates of registrations, and the estimates are sort of all over the place. The report that I mentioned before with the Tampa Bay Times, they estimated about 31,000 registered to vote. A Georgetown law professor estimated it was about 45,000, and then the Florida Rights Restoration Council Coalition estimated it about 67,000. So if you just look at the range of those numbers, we're still in a period of uncertainty as to who from this population actually did turn out to vote.
And please do send your questions forward, questions and comments forward to the Q&A box below. Another question, maybe I missed it, but do we know how many former felons in Florida were able to pay off their fines and vote in this election? Did Bloomberg's funding help?
And very similar to that previous question, it's just too early to say. The numbers and the estimates are just so varied. It'll take a little bit more time to put that information together.
We had a question in the chat. I think you've certainly already answered it, but someone was wanting to explain the meaning of felon disenfranchisement and to give some examples. Perhaps there's some wider ranging examples. I don't know. That you could
Well, felon disenfranchisement really has to do with the ability to vote and how a felony conviction prevents an individual from voting. But having a criminal record, there are some other limitations attached to having that criminal record, of which felon disenfranchisement is one. They're called collateral consequences. So essentially there are, like, for example, being able to, I think Sherri mentioned this, own a firearm, jury service, practice certain professions. Some of those things are barred from individuals based on their felony conviction, but felon disenfranchisement deals solely with an individual's ability to vote.
Okay, we're getting questions coming in. They're coming. I'm trying to manage both the chat and the Q&A. So I'm looking at the chat now. I'm interested in the discussion about the post-Civil War changes to the criminal justice system as a way to achieve slavery in a different form, no job, no voice, no opportunity. What responses might you have to that?
So thinking about the flurry of felon disenfranchisement laws as we see them now, the current version, really occurred after the passage of the 15th Amendment. And it would be hard to not link that to voter suppression in some way. And the fact that the expansion of these criminal codes were done so in that fashion when poll taxes could no longer be justified and literacy tests, those sort of things, as they came about later on, they just compounded and added to the fact that these individuals could not participate. So it's kind of hard to separate it and to think of it as not a part of voter suppression, as those other tactics were.
So I would like to ask myself, my first teaching job was in Selma, Alabama, well known as an important location to the Voting Rights Act. And do you see a pattern in the Deep South of using felon disenfranchisement in this way to suppress Black vote in a particularly focused way? From
some research that I've done, I have found that there is evidence that former Confederate states did have higher levels of racial animosity, and those higher levels of racial animosity translated to having more severe felon disenfranchisement laws. So with felon disenfranchisement laws, it can range to being barred permanently from voting. They can also be time limits attached to voting. So maybe, and then there's also automatic restoration. So with automatic restoration, as soon as you're released, as soon as you're released or you finished your term, your rights are automatically restored. Some states have a time limit in place, maybe 1 to 5 years or something of that nature. And after that time, then you can vote. And then Florida, the way it was before Amendment 4, it was that you were permanently barred unless you applied through that executive clemency. So to answer your question, Keith, yes, there is evidence clearly that there is a racial element to this in terms of the racial animosity, but there's also evidence that former Confederate states were more likely to adopt that harsher level of felon disenfranchisement.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Joseph Sarant. How can we help spread the word and educate people on this topic?
That's there are lots of organizations, and the one that I mentioned has been doing a lot of work. The Florida Rights Restoration Coalition has been doing quite a bit of work to spread the word about felon disenfranchisement. And this is important because I think for many of us in the public, we have this perception sort of as us versus them, and we don't realize that we're all us. They are our neighbors, there are students, there are people in our communities. And I think having organizations such as that, and even locally in Jacksonville, there are organizations, Operation New Hope does a lot of work in this area as well. Organizations sort of spreading the word, the Urban League, spreading the word about this topic and trying to educate people about the fact that these are still people at the end of the day. And these structural limitations are in place, and they do disproportionately impact certain individuals.
Yeah, I would add too that talk to your friends and family, in your own immediate circle. Things that you learned, that you may have learned on this webinar, share that with some of your friends and family. Maybe they can get a different picture, a face of what they think about when they hear felon or returning citizen. And it won't be like Dr. Christie mentioned how, they say, oh, these murderers and this, that's not the whole picture of a person that's been convicted of a felony. So I would definitely encourage you to just talk to your friends. And I can remember a discussion board I did with a young lady. I mentioned this to Dr. Christie, and how she was saying felons should not have the right to vote because they don't have good decision-making skills, they're immoral. She was literally just going down the list, and I'm like, whoa, hey, maybe I can get you to looking at this in a different way. I'm like, hey, look at me. Maybe just take myself, for example. I shared with her my history, and I said, and I'm a mother of college graduates, a grandmother. I'm full-time, I work full-time, is this the picture, that you're seeing in your head when you think felon? And just anything we could do to kind of change people's perceptions of what a felon looks like. And I think that's very helpful. So that's why I said, even start with your friends and family. Even if you're not necessarily able to connect with an organization, just talk to your circle. Maybe enlighten them on some of the things you've learned. Kind of just change that mindset up a little bit.
So we have another question from Jason Edgar. He says, in what I feel is a similar vein with the Census Act of 1790, we count people at their usual residence. For prisoners, this would be where they're incarcerated. This creates a large shift in political clout and resources from areas that don't contain prisons to areas that do contain prisons. So they count to the benefit of their incarcerating county, but not to their home county.
Right, and that's essentially what they've termed prison gerrymandering. So individuals who are displaced from their communities in terms of the census, they are then counted in the location where the prison is. And most times, if you think about where most prisons are located, they're located in these rural counties. And for the most part, the majority of these prisoners are coming from from sort of the urban core and from some communities that are financially, economically depressed. And by having these individuals counted at the prison's location, you're essentially taking away funding for at least for categorical funding, taking away funding from their home communities. And that funding is then being funneled to those rural communities because it is increasing the size of the population in those communities. I hope I answered that question.
Thank you. You know, and I think many of us also have to recognize that it's only luck, entitlement, privilege, certain dealings with the police that they weren't seeing that kept a lot of us from felony convictions or other encounters with the law. I'm thinking back to my childhood and many of my friends, and the ways the law is enforced has tremendous, has a lot to do with who loses their rights and who doesn't.
And it impacts where we are right now and what we see right now. And and some argue it goes back to the school to prison pipeline. It goes even further back than that. So it really, we're looking at this one snapshot right now and talking about felon disenfranchisement, but it is systematic, and it needs to be reviewed and to be looked at all these different points and stages in a systematic way.
So we have a question from Jillian Myers. Thank you so much for the seminar. Actually, it's not a question, it's chat. Thank you for sharing your experience, Sherri. It's incredibly sad you have to defend yourself to be considered a citizen. All citizens should be permitted to vote and have their voices heard about how the government should work. People who have been convicted of a felony are subject to these laws and systems just as much as people who have not. So thanks to all of you. Are there any more questions? We've had some excellent questions, and this is a far-reaching issue. Any final thoughts from our panelists?
Yeah, I would just like to thank everyone who participated, because I do think it's very important to kind of talk about things so we can get it out in the open. We can maybe break some stereotypes. So I just wanted to say thank you and share the information with other people. Just kind of, like I said in the chat, we can all make some changes if we all start, just working together for those changes and kind of opening ourselves up to that change and realizing that things don't always have to stay the same, especially when they're broken. And I definitely think this is broken.
And that's a really great point. Something that I thought about, at least when I first started thinking about this topic, is thinking about, I compared it to sort of just like, I read somewhere about a jar, like reusing a jar, right? And if a jar has something in it originally, and that whatever is in it is malodorous, right? Sort of like how this whole thinking about felon disenfranchisement came about. And what you keep doing is just sort of refilling that jar. You're going to get to a point where you're going to have to get rid of that jar, or else the remnants are just going to continue to persevere the more that we use it in that system. So in a sense, in order for us to break away from what we're doing now, we really have to go back and change our thinking and start change our systems from the very beginning, because all we're doing is just perpetuating what the original intent of that legislation was.
Right on point. Thank you so much, Sherri and Natasha, for an informative and passionate presentation at a most timely moment. I think it's a great way to conclude the fall session of our series. And thank you, audience, everybody that's come to these. We've received great support for these sessions. We do aim to continue in the spring with a new lineup, and we want to keep this going and keep our focus on social justice in Jacksonville, at UNF, the ways we can all come and reason together, dream together, think together, show respect, learn. We have a long way to go, and we're committed here at the university to making steady progress. And so this has been a great concluding session for the fall. Please join us next spring, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.